Okay, here we are, PowerPoint 3 in the set of slides, supporting the MBA Educational Leadership in terms of preparing for your dissertation. So the first two sets of slides are covered out how you get a focus of your work, and the second set of slides is how you arrive at establishing what it is you want to research. In this section, I want to talk about methodology. Now you'll notice there's an ology at the end of method. So there's a difference between method and methodology, and I will try and explain that more fully as we go forward. But methodology is trying to establish the best way in which you can investigate your chosen subject or topic or question. So methodology is therefore discussion about how your research focus could be answered. And this is going to be a key part of the dissertation in examining how you could answer what it is you've set yourself, whether it be a hypothesis or a research question. Are you going to use primary and or secondary data? And I explained primary and secondary data in the last set. More often than not, most of you want to use primary data because you're investigating something which is very close to your heart. However, you can use secondary data, or as I will say later, we'll come on to something called big data, but I'll leave you thinking about that later. Okay, which paradigm is best suited to investigate your research, your planned research? And a paradigm is a set of ideas, a set of way of doing things. In terms of research paradigms, it's the general way in which you set about something, and whether you're going to do a particular type of research or you're going to use a mixed methods or another type altogether. We're going to investigate what your role is and your relationship with the data and the data sources, because this is critical. As I said in the last set of slides, sometimes there is what we call a potential for bias when you're only seeing what you want to see, and what we've got to do is to find out how you as a researcher are influencing both the data collection and the data analysis. We need to define the research population and the sample. And again, in the last set of slides, I talked about the number of head teachers that were in England at the time I did my survey, and that was 21,000. That's my research population. The sample size I chose was 10%. Now, it wasn't always as simple as that because I wanted the stratified sample. In other words, I wanted each strata of schools to have representations. And there was something like 10 sets of schools. There's infant schools, there was infant with junior schools, there were middle schools. And part of middle schools' problem is you have middle schools deemed primary and middle schools deemed secondary. And in the country, there were only at the time something like 22 schools that were deemed middle schools secondary. In other words, they dealt with children who were secondary age like 9 to 13, whereas most primary schools are 7 to 11, and some middle schools are largely primary education like 8 to 12. So those middle schools deemed secondary, there are only 22 in the country. 10% sample of that is 2, and you can't draw any conclusions from that. So I had to be a bit more inventive with that aspect of education, of schooling, and identify a number of middle schools deemed secondary that could be part of my sample. But generally the 10% sample size, but what I wanted was a representative sample in this particular instance. And then the last thing is what resources are available. Now, if you think about it, I've just described doing a major survey which required a great deal of paper, in those days unfortunately, and a great deal of mailing, and a great deal of data handling. Now, I was fortunate in having someone working alongside me who was a willing volunteer, but if you're on your own, which most of you will be, you've got to look and say, how can I manage this? There's nothing to stop you getting some additional resources if you can afford it or if you can persuade people to do it, but you must be conscious that if you take on a project, can you actually provide the resources to look at it effectively? So let's talk about paradigms. Okay, and I said paradigms is a way of thinking, and in research, or a set of rules if you like, it's an understanding of the world. There are some generally about 4 paradigms, research paradigms, that we could be engaged in. Okay, The first of these is what's known as the positivist scientific approach, more commonly called quantitative. The second is what's called an interpretivist approach, sometimes called phenomenological. It's looking at a social setting or some setting where you're trying to understand what's going on there, and that's known as qualitative. And that tends, in the first instance, quantitative, to be about numbers. In the second, qualitative, it invariably ends up as words. The third paradigm is you could go for mixed methods. You could either do something sequentially, like you could do a short, sharp survey and then follow it up with interviews or some other sort of qualitative work, or you could do a qualitative set of conversations with people and then develop a research instrument. So one of my students, for example, on a doctoral program, discovered an area of her world which hadn't been researched successfully, and there was no evidence on which to build a survey. So she conducted a number of interviews with people. They were actually female head teachers, to ask them their level of job satisfaction, what things, shall we say, affected their sense of job satisfaction. She then followed up as the consequence of those first set of interviews, being able to define common factors, which we then converted into a survey, where she surveyed hundreds of head teachers, analysed the results, and then the third stage of her study was to do some more qualitative work to check the validity of those results. So it's quite legitimate to have a mixed methods approach. Okay, and the final one is something very often touted and used in education called action research. Many people don't understand action research and get themselves confused. I'm going to talk you through exactly what action research is in a minute, but it's not just research on what's happening, it's a specific way of undertaking research. So those are the four research paradigms you'll come across, and generally you will lend yourself to one of those. Okay. So quantitative researchers usually means people are testing hypotheses, research questions, or objectives within a body of knowledge that exists, and they're testing it to see whether the same thing is true in their particular setting. So they deal mainly with objective measures, commonly in numbers. How many people thought this? How many people were witness doing that? How many people considered this? And it's numbers that dominate. So you come up with descriptive statistics at the end of it, and you come up with the option of doing what's called analytic descriptive statistics. Now, I was halfway through explaining there the difference between descriptive statistics, and I should have said inferential statistics. And what descriptive statistics do is just tell you the general population, what the results are. So for example, if you survey a group of teachers and you say 60 teachers were asked the following question, then you can decide 36% of them felt this, 27% of them felt that, etc., etc. That's descriptive statistics. Inferential statistics is where you're trying to establish whether there's a difference between the way in which certain groups reply or certain conditions under which they try, and there are all sorts of complicated statistics and formula that are needed. Generally, you can do descriptive statistics on a calculator. Inferential statistics, you do need complex formula to actually work out. So for example, you might want to say, is there a difference in the attitudes of young teachers as opposed to teachers aged 30 to 45? So in that case, you've got to come up with a way of seeing whether there is something different between one group and another. That's the inference. Can you infer something from the findings? So when you're doing quantitative research, it does involve numbers. We generally talk about surveys and experiments as being the way, and we can't do experiments with human beings, by the way, but we can do surveys. So it might be possible, or it might be that you want to do something in terms of finding out what all of the people you know or you are in contact feel about a certain issue. One of your colleagues last year, for example, investigated something called toxic leadership. That's where leadership was being effected in such a way that people felt badly about the way they were being treated. Developed a questionnaire survey which she sent to several universities in the country where she was working, and accumulated quite a lot of data which gave feedback. Okay, now the key issues in establishing a questionnaire of that nature are you've got to have valid questions and the instrument has to be reliable. Now I'm not going to spend too much time on this particular thing, talking about what makes a good questionnaire. I have written a chapter which is available to you called Collecting Quantitative Data, and that's on the Moodle site. Now I see we've been running for about 10 minutes now, so what I'm going to do is to pause at this point, and then I suggest you take a break for a few minutes and then come back. You might just want to stand up and stretch, you might want to walk around the room, you may have somebody, you've got a phone, but take a break and then I will start talking again on the next slide, but you can take a break after this slide. Okay, welcome back. We're now going to talk about qualitative, and I've used this big word, phenomenological. Okay, in other words, you're investigating a phenomenon, you're investigating something unusual, and qualitative work generally ends up in words where you're interpreting what goes on, because you remember at the start of this I talked about the interpretivist approach, and what you do in qualitative inquiry, you look at lived experience and you're looking at what's happening with unique and special issues about people. In other words, it's unlikely that you'll be able to generalize from what you find. Okay, you're often going to be looking at a small part of a bigger system, and your explanation is rich and thick and selective rather than representational. With surveys, for example, you can quickly gather a number of people, huge amount of data. With qualitative inquiries, you've got to understand how people feel, so it's difficult to collect huge amounts of data. I did an inquiry based in a school where we accumulated something like 54 interviews over a 3-year period, and by the time we got those into a workable format where we could analyze what people were saying, we had something like 500,000 words. So it's rich, it's thick. Okay, it's not going to show us everything we could show, it's not going to be representational, but it is going to show a clear insight into a particular situation, a phenomenon or a unique situation. You can't do this in the absence of literature and theory, however. There still needs to be some reason why you are doing this, and it has to be pinned on your research questions. Keywords in qualitative research are credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. Now, this is a research writer called Alan Bryman. He's on your list of things you should consult. He does social research methods. He's been publishing a book for many years. It's a really good book because he gives worked examples of the way in which you do things. But those 4 words, therefore, say you can't generalize, but what you're looking at has to be credible. There has to be some way of showing that the data you accumulate actually produce the results you claim. Okay, other words that operate in qualitative research are relatability. Rather than generalizability, it's relatability. Is what's being seen liable to be seen in similar circumstances? It won't be identical, but will it be similar? Another key word there, or keywords, authenticity and trustworthiness. In other words, is the data authentic, and what you're seeing, is it trustworthy? Now, there's many things you're going to have to investigate as to how to make that happen, but what it comes down to is to be rigorous with your inquiry and to be able to show that what you're doing is worthy and you've applied rigor to your inquiry. Lincoln and Goober, by the way, often appear as Goober and Lincoln. These are the authors. So you've got Bassi, it's worth having a look at. Bryman definitely does, so the first 4, and Lincoln and Goober talking about concepts of authenticity and trustworthiness. Now remember, this section is you justifying why you're choosing a certain way of gathering your data and researching your topic or issue. But I said there was a fourth paradigm, which is called action research, and this was very popular, particularly in education. And unlike any other aspect of research, what you do with action research is try something and see what happens. What you do with the other types of research is you collect data and then decide what to do next. So with action research, it typically starts with the words, how can I, or how can we? So you say something like, how can we improve the learning of a certain group of children in our school? And you don't know the answer, so you're going to try things out. Now, in many ways, it's just like teaching action research, in that you would try and say, how can I get this concept across to these group of people who have different interests, different focuses, different foci, different approaches to life, different levels of understanding. So you might find ways in which you try something, they don't get it, you try something else. That's exactly what action research is. It's actually an approach to improving education by changing it and learning from that change. Okay, and it looks like this. You've got this continuous cycle of activity, and what you do is you take an action. Okay, you see what's going to happen, you plan to do something, you've got a result from a previous thing, something has happened in the past, and you're trying to make a plan to try and do something different. You take action, you evaluate that action and decide whether you need to do something different to make it work. Okay, so action research is actually a series of cycles of activity. What am I trying to try and do? I'll try this. Did it work? If it didn't, what else do I need to do differently? And so you have to approach it as being cycle after cycle after cycle. And it goes on for a long time, therefore. Okay, it's something about you acting, reflecting and reviewing. You see that third bullet point there? It's very open-minded about what counts as evidence, but some people rely heavily on a personal journal and personal reflections. Okay, you do need to make a critical analysis of the situations in which you work. Now, the health warning, why I've said health warning, is that action research takes a lot of time. It's not something you can do over a couple of weeks, saying, oh, I'll do a survey or I'll do some interviews. You actually have to plan to do something, be able to evaluate it, then move on, try something different until you get the result you're looking for. Now, it's very popular because it seems to give you something to do. You can take action before you've gathered data, and then you gather data as you go to try and make sense of whether you are making the impact you decided you wanted to make or not. Now, nothing to stop you doing action research, but make sure you are doing action research and not research on action. This is where a lot of people get confused in education. They think they're going to look at something that's happening and they say, oh, I'm doing action research. No, action research is where you decide to make a change and you're not quite sure how to make that change. So effectively you are trying things out, seeing if it worked. If it did, how can you build upon it? If it didn't, what else can we do to make it work? Okay. So if you're thinking your paradigm might be action research, make sure you do the reading to understand what action research is. Your second health warning is on case studies. Okay, lots of people come to me or to our supervisors and say, we're going to do a case study. Well, be very sure what it is you're doing as a case study. Okay? Case studies are about the individual case, not by a method of inquiry. So in other words, you're looking at something that exists, a phenomenon, okay, in its natural context and from the perspectives of the people involved in it. That's the second bullet point there. So you're looking at an individual case. This is not a methodology in itself. What you're saying is a case study is where you're studying a case. Duh. You'd expect it to be that, wouldn't you? But people do seem to think that there's some mystical thing called case study methodology. It isn't. Data in case studies can be in the form of words, images, physical objects, but also could include some quantitative data. And often in a case study, you're collecting it over an extended time period and you're using several different methods of data collection. Now, this is popular if you're, say, trying to introduce something like, say, a new curriculum. Okay, or a new way of encouraging good behavior. okay, within an educational setting amongst the student body. And you would therefore take some time to look at what's going on and to see whether you're having an impact and you're actually moving things on, rather than saying, I did this, therefore it's going to work, or this is what we could do. So in a way, case studies you need to be aware that you can't oversell the idea of case studies, and they do require a lot of work. Again, it's probably time for you to take a break, okay? But now we resume with moving on to our next area of warning, which is the concept of grounded theory. Now you'll see a lot of people citing the words grounded theory. What it means is that theory emerges from the ground. Okay, in your situation, you are devising a research question and there may be no theory that applies to it. More often than not there is, because grounded theory is actually a very formalized approach to the way in which data is gathered and used. Okay, and the idea is they don't want to go into, grounded theorists don't want to go into an inquiry on the basis of assumptions or expectations. They are actually wanting to look at the data and looking for patterns. Okay, now they suggest that somehow you come to a situation without any preconceptions, without any assumptions, without any expectations of what it is you're going to find. You literally just get the data, analyze it, or explore it to make sure your analysis is not biased, and the only influence on your findings are the actual data collected. Now, I'm a bit of a, I don't know how to describe myself. I'm not really fond of the notion of grounded theory, although I like some of the practices that grounded theorists represent, okay, or recommend. So I'm a bit of a cautious there. I tend to say, please don't use the words, this is grounded theory. My advice is to say this is using techniques and methods often associated with the concept of grounded theory. In other words, some of the practices are very, very good, but the idea that you can't have any preconceptions is nonsense in my view. And if you read my chapter on analysing qualitative data, I'm quite firm about that, in terms of saying I don't think it's possible, because we don't exist in a vacuum. We come to it with life experiences, with expectations, with other, things that are going on that say we've actually formulated some idea of what it is we're likely to see. So grounded theory is a purist approach. And if you use the words grounded theory and you're not a grounded theorist, they tend to be very, very tough on you, really tough. So it's an area I'm trying to avoid claiming to be an expert or to use. I use some of the concepts or methods associated with grounded theory. So, key factors in methodological discourse. So remember now, you are working towards actually producing effectively your research design and ultimately your chapter on methodology, methods and data. Okay, so the key factors that you should be looking for are your methodology is actually discourse on how your research focus could be answered. Now, you're not writing a textbook, so you don't have to tell us everything there is to know about quantitative or qualitative analysis or mixed methods. You actually give a rationalized argument as to how you want to investigate your chosen research focus and say why it is that you have chosen to do it in a particular way. Okay, so you may find there's all sorts of reasons you can apply to that. So, are you going to use primary or secondary data? We covered that point already, okay? Which paradigm is best suited? We've covered that point, okay? What is the role of the researcher and the relationship with data sources is a big issue. And this is where you as the researcher have to feature in your own research. So let's just imagine you've decided you're going to research something going on in your setting. Let's imagine you're in, say, a multi-academy trust and you want to see how decisions are being made at the local level, i.e. within a school within the trust. And remember, a multi-academy trust has multiple numbers of schools. It could be anything between 2 and up to 50 schools in England, okay? And you want to find out what's going on in terms of how decisions are made and how the local governing body or the people who advise the school within the multi-academy trust are actually taking account of what the trust itself is saying. You might decide you want to do a survey, and therefore you're going to generate primary data. You might want to look at the reports that they are producing at school level, therefore you want to use it secondary data. Is it going to be something where you're looking for the numbers of times things happen, the numbers of people involved, or are you looking at lived experience? So which paradigm is going to be, or is it going to be both, or a combination? Is it going to be quantitative? Is it going to be qualitative? Is it going to be mixed methods? Okay. But the role of researcher in your relationship with data sources is something which is going to be the feature of the next presentation, this PowerPoint presentation as we're doing. Finally, the next thing you've got to look at is what was the research population of the sample, and we will talk about how you define the sample and what basis you will do that. Okay. Finally, your research methodology is an investigation into what resources are available to help you do this. So we'll stop there because we've explained the role of methodology, which will become your chapter. Okay, and your chapter will obviously relate to the way in which you plan to deliver a research design, or you are designing your research, which will be updated to how you did actually undertake your research, what it was you had to decide, how you were going to do it, what happened, and what you started to find as a result of implementing your research design. That's your research chapter. Okay.